Adaeze, ask me again when there are no cameras.
I will ask her every day until she says yes.
The slap came before the apology ever could. Adaeze Okonkwo felt the sting of cold water against her chest before she even registered what had happened. A full glass, thrown with precision, the kind of precision that only comes from practice. The crystal tumbler hit the marble floor and shattered at her feet while 20 guests at the Kwon family dinner table turned to stare. Her white serving uniform was soaked through. Her hands were still holding the silver tray. She did not drop it. Kwon Yuna rose slowly from her chair at the head of the table, smoothing her Valentino dress with both hands, her voice carrying the kind of calm that is far more dangerous than screaming. "You spilled on me first," Yuna said. "Didn't you?" It was not a question. Adaeze stood very still. The water dripped from her collar to the floor. The room was silent except for the sound of it. She looked at the tablecloth, at the untouched wine glass nearest to her, at the dry sleeve of Yuna's dress. Not a drop on it. There had been no spill. There had never been a spill. Don't speak," Yuna said softly. Maids don't speak at the table. And that was the night Adaeze Okonkwo understood exactly what kind of household she had walked into. She had come to Seoul 3 months earlier with a single carry-on bag, a business administration degree she could not use, and a bruise beneath her left eye that foundation could no longer fully cover. Lagos had stopped being safe the moment her ex-fiancé's name became powerful enough that even her family stopped answering her calls. A distant aunt had arranged the position, live-in domestic staff, for one of Seoul's wealthiest private households. The Kwon estate. 12 bedrooms, 4 floors, a garden that looked like someone had painted it by hand, and a head housekeeper named Madame Bay who met Adaeze at the service entrance with a clipboard and a look that said she had seen women like Adaeze before. Women who arrived carrying more than luggage and had watched most of them leave the same way. "Eyes down," Madame Bay told her on the first night. "Speak when spoken to. Do not be seen unless you are working. And never, under any circumstances, let Madame Yuna see you standing still." Adaeze had nodded. She was good at rules. Rules kept her safe. She learned the house in 5 days. The layout of the kitchen. The temperature Madame Kwon, the billionaire's mother, preferred her morning tea. The exact angle at which the breakfast tray had to be presented in the east dining room, or it would be sent back. She learned which hallways had cameras and which did not. She learned that Kwon Seo-jun, the man whose household this technically was, moved through his own home like a ghost, never raising his voice, never staying in a room longer than necessary, never once acknowledging that the people serving him were human beings with names. She told herself that was fine. She did not need to be acknowledged. She needed to be invisible, to save money, to disappear into the rhythm of this place until she could afford to build something new. She had survived worse than silence. She had not accounted for Yuna. Kwon Yuna arrived every Friday evening like a weather system moving in from the coast. The entire household shifted when her car pulled through the gate. Staff walked faster, voices dropped, the air itself seemed to tighten. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, aggressively, as though beauty were a weapon she had trained herself to use. She was engaged to Seo-jun through an arrangement that had more to do with the merger of 2 criminal empires than with love, and she wore that arrangement like armor. She noticed Adaeze on the second Friday. Not immediately. Adaeze was careful. She was always careful, but during afternoon tea in the garden, when Adaeze set the tray down and straightened up and for one unguarded second met Yuna's gaze directly instead of looking at the ground. It lasted less than a breath. But Yuna had seen it. And something behind those beautiful eyes had calculated. The following Monday, a diamond earring went missing from Yuna's private suite. Yuna told Madame Bay that Adaeze had been cleaning the room at the time. Adaeze had not been in that room. She had been in the kitchen preparing the weekly inventory. 3 other staff members could confirm this. None of them did. Madame Bay called Adaeze in and asked her, very quietly, very carefully, if she had seen the earring. Adaeze said no. Madame Bay looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "Be more careful in future," which was not a reprimand but a warning, which told Adaeze everything she needed to know about how protected she was in this house. The earring reappeared 4 days later in Yuna's handbag. No one mentioned it. And then came the dinner. The water glass. The shattered crystal and the soaked uniform and Yuna's voice like a blade, smooth and deliberate, telling her that maids did not speak at the table. Adaeze stood in the laundry room afterward, pressing a cold cloth against her chest, not because it did not hurt, but because she needed something to hold on to. Her hands were trembling, not from fear. From the effort it took to keep everything she was feeling locked behind her sternum where no one in this house would ever see it. The door opened behind her. She turned, expecting Madame Bae. It was not Madame Bae. Kwon Seo-jun stood in the doorway of his own laundry room in his dinner suit, a glass of water in his hand, not the thrown kind, just water, and he set it on the counter beside her without looking at her directly. "There is a first aid kit under the third shelf," he said. He left before she could respond. Adaeze stared at the closed door for a long time. Then she looked at the counter. The glass of water was still there, cool and steady, like a quiet thing in a loud house. She pressed her fingers around it and held on. Play button if you are still watching this. You already know this story is not going to go the way Yuna planned. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens at that rooftop gala is something you cannot afford to miss. 3 weeks passed and Adaeze learned something about Kwon Seo-jun that nobody in that house seemed to have noticed yet. He watched everything. Not obviously, he was never obvious. He did not stare, did not linger, did not ask questions. But Adaeze had spent enough of her life around dangerous men to know the difference between a man who was absent and a man who was choosing to appear absent. Seo-jun was always choosing. Every movement in that house was deliberate. Every silence was a decision. And sometimes, in the corner of a hallway mirror, or in the brief second before he turned away from a doorway, she would catch the edge of his attention sitting on her like a hand she had not given permission to land. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like him noticed the people who served them only when something went wrong. She was simply being evaluated for the probability of error. That was all. She focused on the work. And the work, at least, she was extraordinary at. Within a month, she had quietly restructured the household schedule. Nothing dramatic, nothing that drew attention, but the kitchen ran 40 minutes faster in the morning. The weekly supplier orders stopped producing the shortfalls that had been causing Madame Bae quiet distress for years, and when the head chef resigned without notice 4 days before a dinner for 12 business associates, it was Adaeze who stepped into the kitchen at 5 in the morning and produced a 4-course meal from what was available, plated with the kind of precision that made 2 of the guests ask Madame Bae who the new chef was. Madame Bae said nothing. But the next morning she left a better uniform hanging outside Adaeze's door without explanation. Yuna noticed too. That was the problem. She arrived the following Friday in a sharper mood than usual, her phone pressed to her ear before the car door was fully open, her voice carrying across the forecourt in a way that made the garden staff suddenly find reasons to be somewhere else. She walked through the house like an inspection, running one finger along surfaces, opening cupboards, rearranging things that did not need rearranging. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and watched Adaeze work for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "You have been overstepping." Adaeze did not stop what she was doing. "I have been doing my job, Madame Yuna." "Your job," Yuna said, "is what I tell you it is. Nothing more." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Adaeze set down the knife she was holding slowly, carefully, blade away, and turned. She looked at Yuna directly. Not defiantly. Not submissively. Simply directly, the way one person looks at another person, which was apparently already enough. "You are very confident for someone in your position," Yuna said quietly. "I find that interesting." She left without touching her afternoon tea. That evening, Adaeze was in the East Garden at midnight, sitting on the low stone bench near the persimmon tree with her Igbo novel open across her knees, the one her mother had pressed into her hands at the Lagos airport with both palms like a blessing. She read when she could not sleep. She could not sleep most nights. She did not hear him approach. He moved the way his house moved, quietly, like it was all one organism. And when she looked up, Seo-jun was standing 3 feet away with his jacket off and his collar open, and the particular expression of a man who has not decided yet whether he intends to speak. He sat down on the other end of the bench without asking. Adaeze closed her book. What is it about? He said. She looked at him. It is about a woman who has told her whole life that she is too much, she said. And what happens when she finally believes them? Something moved through his expression that she could not name. He was quiet for a moment. The garden held them both in its dark. Does she survive it? He asked. I have not finished it yet, Adaeze said. He almost smiled. It was such a small thing, barely a shift at the corner of his mouth, but in a face that gave away nothing, it was enormous. He looked out at the garden. She looked back at her book. They sat in silence for 20 minutes, and it was the most comfortable Adaeze had felt since she arrived in Seoul. She told herself that meant nothing either. Yuna's next move was precise, and it was cruel, and it was designed to leave no fingerprints. She began with the other staff. A word here, a suggestion there. Had anyone else noticed that the new girl seemed very comfortable in spaces that were not hers? Had anyone noticed the way she carried herself, like she was waiting for something? Yuna had a gift for planting seeds in the minds of people who were already afraid, and within a week the kitchen staff had grown quiet around Adaeze, and the two housemaids who had previously shared meals with her in the service room had found reasons to eat at different times. Adaeze ate alone. She was used to alone. She sharpened it into something useful. Then Madame Kwon summoned her. Seo-jun's mother was 71 years old and moved through the house in a silk robe the color of ash, and she had the kind of face that had stopped performing emotions for other people's benefit sometime around 1987. She took tea in her private sitting room every morning at 9, and she had never, in the 3 months Adaeze had been in this house, requested her presence directly. Adaeze stood in the doorway of the sitting room and waited. Sit, Madame Kwon said, without looking up from her cup. Adaeze sat. The old woman studied her the way you study a piece of calligraphy, looking for the intention behind the stroke, not just the stroke itself. She asked about Adaeze's family in Nigeria, about her father's work, about what she had studied at university. Her eyes never softened, but they sharpened in a way that felt, somehow, like the same thing. When Adaeze finished speaking, Madame Kwon was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across and refilled Adaeze's teacup without being asked. In this household, Adaeze had learned that gesture meant more than words. She was walking back through the main corridor when she heard Yuna's voice from the dining room, sharp, public, designed to carry. Where is she? Bring her in here. Now. Adaeze stepped through the doorway. There were 4 people at the table. Business associates of Seo-jun's, 2 men she did not recognize, Yuna at the head, and at the far end, still and watchful, Seo-jun himself. On the table, Yuna's bracelet, a slim gold piece, sat in the center like evidence. That bracelet, Yuna said, her voice perfectly controlled, was in my room this morning. Now it is here. And you are the only person who has been in and out of both spaces today. The room was very still. Adaeze felt the familiar cold move through her chest, the same cold from the night of the water glass, the same cold she had been swallowing for months, and she opened her mouth to speak. But Seo-jun spoke first. Where was the bracelet found? He said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. But the room shifted the way rooms shift when the most dangerous person in them decides to engage. Yuna blinked. It was. Where, he said again, was it found? The silence stretched. One of the business associates cleared his throat. Yuna's jaw tightened and she reached into the pocket of her blazer, the one she had been wearing since she arrived that morning, and the bracelet was there. Had been there. In her own pocket the whole time. Seo-jun looked at the room. Then he looked at Adaeze. And in a voice that was not loud and was not gentle, but carried the full weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean, he said. Adaeze does not steal. It was the first time he had said her name. Yuna heard it. Every person in that room heard it. And from the way Yuna's expression went very, very still, she understood exactly what it meant. Play button, do not close this video. The rooftop is coming, and I promise you, nothing about what Seo-jun does next is what anyone in that room expected. Like this video right now if you felt that. We are just getting started. The invitation to the rooftop gala was not extended to Adaeze. It was assigned to her. There was a difference and Yuna understood it perfectly. An invitation implied choice. An assignment implied position. And position, in Yuna's architecture of this evening, was everything. She came to Madame Bay 3 days before the event with a printed staff schedule already completed, already signed, already decided, and Adaeze's name was at the top of the main floor service list in bold, which meant she would be the most visible person carrying a tray in a room full of the most powerful people in Seoul. Madame Bay looked at the schedule for a long moment. Then she looked at Yuna. Then she signed the countercopy without a word because Madame Bay had survived 22 years in this household by understanding which battles belonged to her and which did not. She found Adaeze in the linen room that evening, ironing. "The gala is Saturday," she said. "You will be on the main floor." Adaeze kept ironing. "Yes, Madame Bay." The older woman stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. "Wear the white uniform," she said. "It photographs clearly." Adaeze's iron paused on the fabric. She understood what Madame Bay was not saying. She was going to be visible. That was the point. She was going to be the black woman in the white uniform in the middle of Seoul's elite, and Yuna was going to make very sure that everyone in that room saw exactly that and nothing else. "Thank you, Madame Bay," Adaeze said. Her voice was steady. "I will be ready." The night of the gala arrived the way catastrophic things often do, beautifully. The rooftop had been transformed with white orchids and glass pendant lights and a string quartet playing something European and expensive in the far corner. Seoul spread itself out beneath the terrace like a promise, all light and distance, and the guests arrived in black cars and designer clothes and the particular confidence of people who have never once in their lives been asked to use the service entrance. Adaeze moved through them like water around stone. She had learned, in her months at the Kwon estate, how to make herself frictionless, how to appear and disappear without creating the disturbance of her own presence. She kept her tray level. She kept her eyes at the correct angle, present but not meeting, available but not seen. She absorbed 3 microaggressions in the first 40 minutes without her expression shifting once. A guest who ordered from her in the wrong language and then laughed about it to his companion. A woman who took a glass from her tray without acknowledgement and then looked through her as though the tray had floated over independently. A man who made a comment in Korean, rapid, quiet, aimed at the person beside him that she understood completely and was not meant to. She set her tray down in the kitchen for 30 seconds. She breathed. She picked it back up. In the corridor between the kitchen and the main floor, she almost walked into Seo-jun. He was coming from the direction of the private terrace, alone, jacket still perfect, and he stopped when he saw her, and for one moment neither of them moved. The noise of the party pressed against the walls around them. His eyes moved to the set of her jaw, to the careful controlled nothing she was wearing on her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have hated pity, but something closer to recognition. Like he saw what the evening was costing her, and he was angry about it in the private internal way of a man who has not yet decided what to do with his anger. "Are you all right?" he said. It was a quiet question. Private. Meant only for her. "I am working, sir," she said. He held her gaze for 1 second longer. Then he stepped aside and let her pass. She did not look back. But she felt him watching her walk away, and she held herself straighter for it, which she did not entirely understand and did not have time to examine. The moment came at 47 minutes past 9. Adaeze was crossing the main floor with a fresh tray when she felt the shift in the room, that particular atmospheric change that happens when someone with intent begins moving through a crowd. She did not see Yuna until Yuna was already beside her, already close, already reaching. The fingers closed around the ties at the back of her apron with deliberate force and pulled. The apron came off in one motion, the string snapping, the fabric yanked forward and away, and the tray lurched in Adaeze's hands and 3 glasses hit the marble floor and shattered, and the sound cut through the string quartet, and every conversation on that rooftop, and 200 heads turned at once. The silence was immediate and total. Yuna held the apron in her hand, and she turned to face the room with the expression of someone who has rehearsed this moment and found it satisfying. "I want everyone to understand something," she said. Her voice was clear and social and perfectly pitched to carry. "This," she lifted the apron slightly, "is the help. She is not a guest. She is not a member of this family. She is the help. And I think some people in this room have been confused about that. 200 people. 20 cameras. The string quartet had stopped playing. Adaeze stood in the center of the rooftop in her plain dress, the broken glass at her feet, the apron in Yuna's hand, and she did not move. She did not cry. She did not look at the floor. She stood with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and she looked at a fixed point on the far wall of the terrace, and she breathed, and she held every single thing she was feeling behind her ribs with both hands, and she did not give Yuna the satisfaction of one single visible crack. Her mother had told her once, sitting in their kitchen in Enugu on a Sunday afternoon with the radio playing and jollof on the stove, she had told her, Adaeze, the world will try to make you small. Your job is not to argue with it. Your job is to stand up so straight that the argument becomes embarrassing. She stood up straight. And then the room shifted again. She heard it before she saw it, the particular quality of silence that changes when one person in a crowd begins to move with purpose. The sound of dress shoes on marble, slow and deliberate, crossing the entire length of the rooftop. People stepping aside without being asked. The kind of presence that does not require volume. She made herself look. Kwon Seo-jun was crossing the floor. He was not hurrying. He moved the way he always moved, like the room arranged itself around him, like time had agreed to wait, and his face was the calmest it had ever been, which in a man whose face was always calm meant something else entirely was happening underneath. He stopped in front of Adaeze. Not beside her. In front of her, between her and the room, between her and Yuna, between her and every camera and every eye on that terrace. He reached up and removed his tuxedo jacket. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He shook it once, lightly, and then he placed it around Adaeze's shoulders himself, both hands, smoothing the lapels, adjusting the collar with a care that was so precise and so public and so completely devoid of apology that the room forgot to breathe. Then he turned and looked at Yuna. He did not speak. He did not need to. 33 years of Kwon Seo-jun had taught every person in that room that his silence was not the absence of something, it was the presence of something far worse for whoever was on the receiving end of it. Yuna's face went the color of the white orchids behind her. Someone in the crowd made a sound half breath, half something else. Phones were already up. The footage was already running. And Adaeze stood beneath the weight of his jacket, warm from his body, smelling of cedar and something darker, and felt the thing she had been holding behind her ribs for months shift and crack open just slightly, just enough, because no one, not in Lagos, not in Seoul, not anywhere in the 26 years of her life, had ever stood in front of her like that. Like she was worth standing in front of. He turned back to her. And in a voice low enough that only she could hear it, he said, "Walk with me." She walked with him. 3 steps from the crowd, away from the cameras and the watching faces, he stopped. He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket that was now on her shoulders, and he went down. One knee. On the rooftop floor. In front of 200 people and 20 cameras and a fiancé whose scream, when it came, tore through the Seoul night like something being unmade. The ring was between his fingers, simple, extraordinary, a stone the color of the sea at a depth where light barely reaches, and he held it up and he looked at her, and Adaeze's heart was doing something she did not have language for. Her hands were shaking inside the sleeves of his jacket, and the entire city seemed to hold its breath beneath them. Adaeze, he said. Just her name. Like that was the whole sentence. And every camera on that rooftop caught it. Play button, stop what you are doing right now and subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because her answer, what she says next, is not what he expected. It is not what Yuna expected. It is not what anyone on that rooftop expected. And it is the most powerful thing in this entire story. Do not miss it. The rooftop had never been so quiet. 200 people and not one of them breathing. Yuna's scream had dissolved into the night air, and what was left in its place was the particular silence of a crowd that understands it is watching something it will describe to other people for the rest of its life. Seo-jun was still on one knee. The ring was still between his fingers. And Adaeze Okonkwo, The woman who had arrived in Seoul with a carry-on bag and a bruise she could not explain and a degree she could not use, was standing above him in his tuxedo jacket with 200 eyes pressing against her skin like something physical. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the ring. She looked at his face, that face that gave nothing away and had somehow, over 3 months of corridor silences and midnight gardens and 1 glass of water left on a counter, given her everything she needed to read it. She saw what was underneath the calm. She saw that he was not performing this. She saw that whatever this was, it had been building in him the way things build in quiet men, slowly, completely, with nowhere to go until it had to go somewhere. She saw all of that. And then she looked at the crowd. At the phones. At Yuna, white-faced and rigid at the far end of the terrace, being held back by 2 staff members who understood their employment depended on it. At the cameras. At the 200 people who had come tonight to see Kwon Seo-jun perform Power and were now watching him perform something they had no category for. Adaeze took a slow breath. "Ask me again," she said, "when there are no cameras." The crowd erupted. She did not wait for the noise. She turned and walked toward the interior corridor, and she did not look back, and her hands were shaking so hard inside his jacket sleeves that she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them, and her eyes were burning with something she refused to release in front of any person on that rooftop. She had given them enough tonight. She had given Yuna nothing. She was not about to give 200 strangers her tears. Behind her she heard his voice, carrying over the noise with that particular effortless authority of a man who never needs to raise it. "I will ask her every day," he said, "until she says yes." She kept walking. By morning the video had 9 million views. The clip ran 47 seconds, from the moment Seo-jun began crossing the floor to the moment Adaeze said, "Ask me again," when there are no cameras. And it had been shared across 11 platforms in 14 countries, and the comments were doing what comments do when a piece of footage catches something true, something human. Something that reminds people watching on small screens in ordinary rooms that dignity is real, and that it can survive almost anything that is thrown at it. The top comment, liked 400,000 times, said simply, "She walked away with his jacket and his whole heart, and she knew it." She just wasn't ready to say so yet. Yuna's family called at 7 in the morning. The engagement, they said, was a matter of alliance. It was a matter of business. It was a matter of 2 families whose interests had been woven together for a generation, and one foolish public moment was not going to unravel that. Seo-jun listened to his future father-in-law speak for 4 minutes on speakerphone, and then he said, quietly and without particular emotion, "The engagement is over," and ended the call. His phone rang again immediately. He turned it face down on the desk. In the kitchen, Adaeze was making tea. She did not know what to do with her hands, so she made tea, which was what she had always done when the world moved faster than she could process it. She made something warm and held it and let the heat work its way from her palms inward until the shaking stopped. The jacket was folded over the back of the chair beside her. She had not given it back. She had not been able to make herself give it back, and she was not yet ready to examine what that meant. Madame Bay appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Adaeze, looked at the jacket, looked at Adaeze again, and then turned and walked away without a single word, which from Madame Bay was the loudest possible statement. The summons from Madame Kwon came at 9. Adaeze walked to the old woman's sitting room with her heart in her throat and her chin level, because those 2 things had learned to coexist inside her, and she knocked twice and entered, and Madame Kwon was in her usual chair in her ash-colored robe with her tea and her particular quality of silence that felt less like absence and more like weather. She did not know what to do with her hands, so she made tea, which was what she had always done when the world moved faster than she could process it. She made something warm and held it and let the heat work its way from her palms inward until the shaking stopped. The jacket was folded over the back of the chair beside her. She had not given it back. She had not been able to make herself give it back, and she was not yet ready to examine what that meant. Madame Bay appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Adaeze, looked at the jacket, looked at Adaeze again, and then turned and walked away without a single word, which from Madame Bay was the loudest possible statement. The summons from Madame Kwon came at 9. Adaeze walked to the old woman's sitting room with her heart in her throat and her chin level because those two things had learned to coexist inside her, and she knocked twice and entered, and Madame Kwon was in her usual chair in her ash-colored robe with her tea and her particular quality of silence that felt less like absence and more like weather. She did not speak immediately. She looked at Adaeze the way she had looked at her the first time, that calligraphy look, searching for the intention behind the stroke, and then she set her teacup down and reached into the pocket of her robe and withdrew something small and held it out. It was a photograph. Adaeze took it carefully. It was old, the paper soft at the edges, the colors shifted toward gold the way old photographs go. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, serious-eyed and slight in a white school shirt, holding the hand of a woman whose face held something that Adaeze recognized immediately because she had seen it in her own mirror in the years before Lagos took it from her. Warmth. Undefended, uncomplicated warmth. The kind that does not calculate the cost of itself. His grandmother, Madame Kwon said. She came to this family from nothing. Less than nothing. She came from a village that 3 generations of this family had decided did not count. She paused. They were wrong about her. Adaeze looked at the photograph. The boy's hand in his grandmother's hand. The way he was leaning toward her slightly, like a plant toward a window. She also, Madame Kwon said, had a spine that could not be bent. Adaeze looked up. The old woman's eyes were dry and direct and completely certain. She reached across and closed Adaze's fingers around the photograph, both hands, the way Adaze's own mother had closed her hands around a book at an airport on a night that felt like the end of everything. Stay, Madame Kwon said. Adaze's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once, because it was all she could manage, and Madame Kwon released her hands and picked up her teacup and looked out the window as though the conversation had simply concluded, which it had. Which was the most complete thing anyone had said to Adaeze in months. She sat with the photograph for a long time after she left. The estate was quiet that evening. Yuna's belongings had been collected by midday, a silent procession of staff carrying boxes to a car that Adaeze did not watch leave because she was in the garden, on the stone bench near the persimmon tree, with her Igbo novel open across her knees that she was not reading. The city hummed beyond the walls. The garden held its particular nighttime smell, earth and persimmon, and something green and living, and Adaeze sat in the middle of it and tried to understand what it meant that for the first time in nearly a year, she did not feel the need to calculate an exit. She heard him before she saw him. Or she felt him, that shift in the air that she had learned was specifically his, the way the darkness reorganized itself slightly when he moved through it. He came around the side of the persimmon tree and he was in ordinary clothes for once, dark trousers, a simple shirt, no armor, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was not entirely certain what came next. He sat down beside her on the bench. Not at the other end this time. Beside her. Their shoulders almost touching. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "I want to ask you again." "I know," she said. "I need you to understand something first," he said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the garden held them both in its dark the way it had on that first night that already felt like a different life. My world is not safe. It has never been safe. The people who come close to me become visible to people who would use them. I am telling you this, because you deserve to know what you would be walking into. Not the rooftop version. The real version. Adaeze looked at him for a long time. She thought about Lagos. She thought about what it had cost her to be invisible and how it had not kept her safe anyway. She thought about a woman in an old photograph with warmth on her face and a boy leaning toward her like a plant toward light. She thought about her mother's hands around a book at an airport. She thought about a glass of water left on a counter in a laundry room at midnight, which was the smallest possible gesture and had somehow been the thing that cracked 3 months of careful nothing right down the center. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan. The ring was there. She had put it there that morning without deciding to, the way you hold on to things before you know you are holding on to them. She drew it out and held it in her palm between them and looked at it for one moment, and then she did something that surprised them both. She placed it in his hand. She watched his expression shift, something moving through it that was not quite confusion, not quite hope, the look of a man preparing himself for an answer he has promised to accept gracefully. Then she reached out and took his hand. The one holding the ring. She guided it. She felt the cool weight of it settle onto her finger, and she held it there for a moment, just held it, just felt it, and then she looked up at him and said the truest, simplest thing she had said since she arrived in Seoul. Then I stay, she said. The garden was very quiet. Seo-jun looked at her hand in his. He looked at the ring on her finger, catching the light from the estate windows. He let out a breath long and slow and complete, the breath of a man releasing something he has been holding for a very long time. And his hand closed around hers, and it did not let go. They sat on the stone bench beneath the persimmon tree with the Seoul skyline glowing beyond the garden walls and the city humming its nighttime sound and the garden holding them in its particular darkness, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that was not already being said by the fact of his hand around hers. She had come to the city with one suitcase and a bruise and a degree folded behind an apron, and a will that 4 months of cold water and broken vases and jealous smiles and public humiliation had not been able to crack. She had kept her spine straight when the room wanted her to fold. She had folded napkins 3 times in silence and served champagne to people who looked through her and stood on a rooftop in front of all of Seoul with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and she had not given them one visible crack. She had waited for the quiet version of this moment. And the quiet version had come. She was never just the maid. She was Adaeze of Enugu, Nigeria. Daughter of a mathematics teacher who told her that every problem has a solution if you are willing to sit with it long enough. Daughter of a woman who pressed a novel into her hands at an airport and said stand up so straight that the argument becomes embarrassing. She had made herself small because survival asked her to. She had endured because she had no other option. She had stood straight on a rooftop because her mother's voice was louder than Yuna's. And she had put the ring in her own pocket and carried it through the whole day and guided his hand herself because she had never been a woman who received the most important things of her life as gifts from other people's hands. She had always been the one who would take it for herself when she was ready. Kwon Seo-jun had not saved her. She had saved herself long before he ever crossed that floor. He simply had the extraordinary good sense to kneel. Play button if Adaeze's story moved something in you, if her dignity, her patience, her spine moved something in you. Share this video right now with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that refuse to make strong women small. And leave me a comment. At what moment did you know that this woman was never going to break? Was it the napkins? The laundry room? The rooftop? I read every single one. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next story.